Salute di Londra, mi dispiace tanto di non essere a Roma bellissima, but I cannot be, and I'm sorry for it. Let me explain first what I'm going to do. I'm going to flash before you by the vehicle of PowerPoint a number of quotations, and there'll be a couple of diagrams and a few pictures. The quotations, there's a point to it. It's not that I've run out of words of my own, but that I want to suggest to you that digital humanities is in bad need of connections with other disciplines. This is a very young discipline, despite being rather old in some people's lives. I must also explain that my throat is rather raw today, so if I sound a little hoarse and drink a lot of water, you'll understand. So let's start. Where we begin is at the intersection, or as I sometimes say, the collision of computational machinery and its sciences with the human sciences, by which I attach the European, French, Italian meaning to the word science. More particularly, we are at the intersection, as far as artificial intelligence is concerned, with human beings and computational automata. Artificial intelligence, I want to argue, is not something that you see in the corner with blinking lights or on your screen. It is created in a relational field when we encounter smart machines. Furthermore, I will emphasize over and over again that artificial intelligence is, as the word literally says, made by art. In a recent London Review of Books, Simon Burroughs quoted Stanley Cavell, "The world of art is ethically charged. The creation of art being human conduct which affects others has the commitments any conduct has. In other words, we have an enormous ethical problem on our hands." My favorite statement about our situation with respect to artificial intelligence was articulated in 1987 by Terry Winograd and Fernando Flores in their wonderful book, Understanding Computers and Cognition. They wrote, "We encounter the deep questions of design when we recognize that in designing tools, we are designing ways of being." So our question is, what ways of being do we want? What does our survival on this planet require of us to want and to see to? Now, the point of all this. Donna Haraway, wonderful Donna Haraway. She says, "The point is to get at how worlds are made and unmade in order to participate in the processes, in order to foster some forms of life and not others." Made and unmade. This is the topic of world making, for which most of us start with Nelson Goodman, but there are many writings on this subject. Wonderful Marilyn Strathern, a friend of mine at Cambridge, in a commentary on Haraway's Cyborg, wrote, "The point is to see a difference. The question is the kind of connection one might conceive between entities that are made and reproduced in different ways, have different origins in that sense, but which work together." There's a book of hers, Partial Connections, in which this occurs, and the title of it says pretty much the same thing. So, artificial intelligence. I sort of did with artificial and now on to intelligence. It is a problem. It is a puzzle. So I want to deal with that, the difference of artificial from biological intelligence, the question of what we do with it, and the question of what to look for. The problem of intelligence, well, Charles Darwin would have none of the drawing of boundaries between ourselves and other animals. Many authors have insisted, he said, that we draw these lines, but he threw that out. He got tired of it. Quite a bit later, the great ethologist Konrad Lorenz attributed intelligence, creativity, to the free play of innumerable factors, a play neither directed at any goal nor predetermined by any cosmic teleology, a play in which nothing is determined except the rules of the game. So there's a problem there. There's a question we have to ask about the extent to which combinatorics comes up with intelligence. But more than that later. So the problem of intelligence as a relational phenomenon, and here's my diagram, it's rather complicated. But basically, I'm pointing to the ties between forms of biological intelligence and artificial made intelligence, dismissing, as Marvin Minsky does, the pre-computational form of smart machines. There has been a lot of discussion about where it is. In the brain, beyond the skull and skin, as more recently has been argued since the 70s, actually. Or I'm going to argue somewhere in between the two. That is, between the brain and the skin and the box in the corner. It's somewhere in between. I give a list of some of the fields where to look for discussion of these matters, but not now. So my conclusion to all this is in agreement with my friend in Cambridge, Jeffrey Lloyd, in his book, Intelligence and Intelligibility, which I recommend, all of his many books, actually. He says, as wide-ranging explorations have shown, intelligence takes so many different forms that any attempt to propose a single definitive account of all its manifestations must be considered foolhardy. In other words, we have many intelligences, not one. Ada Lovelace, who was, as we know, very bright, saw a glimmer of this in Babbage's analytical engine. Now, the first two sentences here, I think it's two sentences, are usually quoted, and you probably know them. But what most people do is stop there. What she goes on to say is quite important. For in so distributing and combining the truths and the formulae of analysis, the relations and the nature of many subjects in that science are necessarily thrown into new lights and more profoundly investigated. Turing picked up on this in his paper in 1950 and basically said that if she'd had more artificial memory at her disposal and greater speed, she might have reached what he thought of as artificial intelligence. So the difference. I turn to the theory of art, particularly Russian formalism, particularly Viktor Shklovsky's famous essay, Artist Technique, 1917, in which he points out that the purpose of art, remember, artificial intelligence is made by art. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar. For artificial intelligence, I take this to mean that its purpose is to unhinge the way we conceive the world, is to make us question, is to raise fundamental and basic questions through, again, going back to Strathern, through the difference of its intelligence from our own. In in the early 1970s, the anthropologist Jonathan Benthel pointed this out. He wrote, wherever we choose to assign the computer in the social hierarchy as slave or oracle or working partner, its anomalous nature will assert itself. We know this already from DeepMind's work, but it needs a lot of underscoring. Its anomalous nature. It's the anomalies which are important, which are most important, especially to us intellectual types. And much before that, John von Neumann, in his last piece of writing, he was very sick at the time and couldn't give this as a lecture, in The Computer and the Brain, he concludes, this is the last part of the last sentence, whatever the central nervous system is, it cannot fail to differ considerably from what we consciously and explicitly consider as mathematics. In other words, the central nervous system, our own and others, is very different from the conceptions we form most clearly in mathematics. So there are two ways of regarding this difference. One, which is what mostly happens, is to reduce it to a satisfactory minimum, which Herbert Simon called satisficing, or to ignore it altogether. What he says, the usual activity of science is to make the wonderful commonplace. And so what I've called official AI. The other way of regarding this difference is to follow its potentially disturbing implications, to look at it as a mode of imagination. This is unofficial AI in my vocabulary. Of course, sometimes the 3A, the reduction, is the practical thing to do. Sometimes it is necessary, sometimes we're compelled to do it. But the second, to follow its potentially disturbing implications, signifies our intelligence, our alertness to, as Haraway said, how worlds are made and unmade. What do we do with this difference? Yes, pretend it doesn't exist, brush it aside, get on with our work, encode our texts, or test it. Then if it glimmers, forgive the metaphor, then if it glimmers, start reimagining our world. What basically to look for is something Charles Taylor and Castoriadis calls a social imaginary. That's a much bigger project than what I have undertaken. I only pretend to have shown how necessary it is. That is, to examine the whole intellectual, physical life world of a people at a particular time or place and make some sense of it, and to get to how they imagine their world, how it can be imagined. Where I have looked over the last year is the earliest history of smart machines, that is, of what ordinary people thought, or rather what they were told to think through their newspapers and magazines on first contact, thus unofficial AI. I did this for the Times of London, the New York Times, Life magazine, Time magazine, and so forth. And yes, only in English, I'm afraid, and only Great Britain and North America. Okay, 1945 to 1965, when people didn't know what it was and weren't following instruction, at least initially weren't following instruction from the experts who were off in a corner doing their thing. So what we see from these newspapers and magazines, scanning for the word brain mostly, which is what the machines were called repeatedly until computer came along a bit later. First, wonders and marvels. Okay, tireless performance, accuracy, dizzying speed of calculation, and startling mnemonic capacity. The near Archimedean leverage. Remember, give me a place to stand and a and a lever and I'll move the world. The near Archimedean leverage conferred on the natural sciences. But this was quickly replaced in the popular literature by the cybernetic might bestowed on the military and industrial funders of official AI before that term actually got out into public circulation. So what do we see in these newspapers and magazines? The great figure, and he was perhaps the best known scientist of his time, Norbert Wiener, in 1948 published his book on cybernetics, or control and communication in the animal and in the machine. More about that. But he was preceded, as David Mindell of MIT has meticulously documented in his book, Between the Human and the Machine, by what was happening in fire control mechanism research, that is to shoot down German planes. We were there once, more efficiently. And that those fire control mechanisms, out of that came the feedback loop of machine and human that developed into automation. On the left, you see from 1946, an article in Fortune magazine that basically described how the automatic factory would work. It was already laid out in the imaginations of some people the year after the Second World War ended. And here you see something rather bizarre looking. Human body parts as functions, and the brain supervising the machinery. And then there's a list over here and so forth. I suggest you look up this article for its, let's say, magical realism. But what that was doing is already forming the ideas that Norbert Wiener popularized in describing the world, and in particular machinery, in physiological terms. What this led to is, first of all, automation. And as Shoshana Zuboff describes in her 1988 book, massive de-skilling of the labor force, and the frightening image of automation standing there as a great giant at the factory gate, almost scaring the pants off the worker coming through the door. Here's from Life magazine. Now, Life magazine, American Life magazine, likes to shout a lot, but this is a very real fear. Now, what I want you to notice is not to dismiss this fear as, oh, these people are being silly and we've grown away from that and so on and so forth, but the extent to which this fear is still with us. Don't block your awareness of fear. It's very, very important. The machines are taking over. Computers outdo man at his work now and soon may outthink him. And there are some real workers in a real workplace, as photographed by the Magnum photographer Burke Uzzell, great man, great photographer, lives in North Carolina. I'm part of the future, but the machine is the brain. What a statement that is. The machine is the brain. And very shortly thereafter, in the nascent cognitive sciences, you could rephrase that, the brain is the machine. And now for other consequences of this unbridled curiosity. And there's a problem with curiosity you can wonder about, but I'm moving on. And that is the atomic bomb first, and the hydrogen bomb very shortly thereafter. If you know Raymond Briggs' wonderful The Snowman, you will deeply appreciate his book in which he shows the fate of this old couple who huddle in their house as radiation poisoning overtakes them. The picture on the right of the culture of dread in the duck and cover exercises for children during the Cold War, that's me. I lived that particular reality and wondered at the cheery teachers describing of what bombs did and the totally unrealistic getting under your desk and protecting the back of your eyes and the back of your head in order to survive an atomic blast. Very silly, even though everyone knew what the bomb did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A very good book called How Reason Almost Lost Its Mind. Yes, Lorraine Daston and colleagues at Max Planck put this together. Very good study describing the strange Lovian sciences, as they call it, of the Cold War. On the left, you see wargaming going on. In other words, people paid very good salaries, very bright people, to imagine what the world would be like after the hydrogen bomb dropped on the US. They imagined only the US, of course. Dr. Strangelove really says it all, except this, perhaps. On the right, snippets, contiguous snippets, but I had to take this picture to squeeze it all on screen, from the testimony given by Robert Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project that developed the bomb and had his hands in the hydrogen bomb as well. The hearing at which he lost his security clearance. He's asked, did you, subsequent to the president's decision in January 1950, ever express any opposition to the production of the hydrogen bomb on moral grounds? Why do you think you would well have said that? He replies briefly. And this is Oppenheimer's words. Because I have always thought it was a dreadful weapon. Even from the technical point of view, it was a sweet and lovely and beautiful job. I have still thought it was a dreadful weapon. There you get what I mean by runaway curiosity. He could not help himself as a scientist. The problem was just too intriguing, and the solution that Teller and Ulam came up with was sweet and lovely and beautiful. This is a real problem. To understand this better, I didn't just depend on my own reactions. I went to searching out commentary, contemporary commentary, and I've chosen for this purpose 3: a magazine advertisement from 1950, a science fiction film from 1955, and a literary author's lecture, an Italian literary author's lecture, by the way, in 1968. Here is the magazine advertisement on the left. It shows a Delphic Sibyl, a figure of a Delphic Sibyl, sitting on top of the IBM World headquarters on 57th Street and Madison Avenue, reading us a long computer printout as a scroll, while underneath her in cutout there is the selective sequence electronic calculator with its big glass windows. Manhattan passersby named it Papa, by the way. This is clearly modeled on Michelangelo's painting of the Delphic on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, which is not far from you, but alas, too far from me. Notice not only the similarities, but also the differences. Klep's Sibyl is calm, assured, reading her scroll. Michelangelo's Delphica is startled, looking away from her scroll. Now, what she's looking at is highly disputed and probably doesn't make a difference. The coming of Christianity had silenced the oracles, so I'm imagining Michelangelo would not have put his Delphica on top of the fissure in the earth, according to which, and I think most experts now agree, there's lots of argument about this, sitting over a fissure of the earth from which came an intoxicating or mind-altering or something like that exhalation that inspired her. So what Klep did is to combine these two and give us an image of the computer as an oracle. Turing had used the word oracle to describe a machine in 1938, and many others. He is a placeholder for how the imagination works other than by mechanical means. And many others have described the machine as an oracle. And it's very important to hang on to this idea, not to dismiss it as a silly fantasy, because the oracle points to sources of historical and anthropological research that help us understand what this means. The science fiction film is Forbidden Planet. I recommend very strongly you watch it. It's made in 1955, so it doesn't conform to our present way of thinking about men and women, but nevertheless, it is a statement of that time. It was modeled on Shakespeare's The Tempest. They did not advertise this, but this is something that came out much later. And it basically what happens is this crew of military crew fly to this planet because nobody said anything from it for a long time. And they discover a philologist, of all things, a philologist, and his daughter. The philologist has been studying the leavings of a very advanced civilization, the Krell. And what they get out, what the crew gets out of him, is what this machine was for. It is a kind of thought materializer. So what they built their civilization by imagining what they wanted, and it would be built by this machine. The problem is that they fell asleep and had bad dreams, and the machine created a monster that wiped them out in a single evening. Now, if you look at the play script here, it gives the exclamation of the doctor, "Monsters, Skipper, monsters from the id." Oh, that's such a wonderful phrase. That's stuck in my mind since I first saw this movie. Monsters from the subconscious mind. This bit of commentary gives us a very dark picture of what an artificial intelligence could eventually do in some way that is materialized, give us the ability to realize our nightmares. And if the hydrogen bomb doesn't realize this, I suppose nothing could. Finally, Italo Calvino's Cybernetics and Ghosts. If you can read it in Italian, please do. I can only read it in English. And I'll read it out for you because it is a very intelligent commentary. Literature is a combinatorial game that pursues the possibilities implicit in its own material, independent of the personality of the poet. But it is a game that, at a certain point, is invested with unexpected meaning, slipped in from another level. The literature machine can perform all the permutations possible on a given material, but the poetic result will be the particular effect of one of these permutations on a man endowed with a consciousness and an unconscious, that is, an empirical and historical man. It will be the shock that occurs only if the writing machine is surrounded by the hidden ghosts of the individual and of his society. So Calvino is imagining an oracular procedure by which storytellers work that summons power from the literary inheritance which we all have. So this again suggests combinatorics as a source of intelligence, but goes beyond simply moving things about to what moving things about summons from our culture to us. And this is both wonderful and terrible. Yes. So what the commentary points to is, first of all, the oracular divinatory model of inquiry, and raises the question, how does this work? There's abundant historical, anthropological, linguistic, and philosophical scholarship on this topic. And this, if you take account of it, at least should cause you to wonder, how did ancient people elsewhere in the world, not so ancient, how do they deal with their most serious questions? When they go to a diviner, as people in Melanesia and Africa do today, what is in it for them? How does this work? How is this like our situation? How is it unlike our situation? That's the first thing of the commentary. The second is what I call the perilous psychodynamics of mind, summoning into consciousness the origins of its wondrous and monstrous consequences. That wondrous and monstrous is a phrase from this wonderful new book, which I can show you, by Eva Jablonka and others, Picturing the Mind, which I recommend very strongly. So that's the second. The third commentary, and given that this commentary was happening when the hydrogen bomb was, hanging over people's heads, sleepwalking into disaster if we don't wake up. I'm really tired of hype and hyper inflated language, but I think that sometimes there's a point, and there is a point, I think, to waking up and doing something, intervening, getting to where things are made and unmade, and summoning the best of our scholarship to speak to it. What is to be done? Now, it's very easy to despair. Scholars, particularly older scholars, will despair. They just sit in their studies and think, and the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Meanwhile, what is to be done? Well, again, Haraway and Strathern. Haraway's, the point is to get at how worlds are made and unmade in order to participate in the processes, in order to foster some forms of life and not others. This is a question, and we're well equipped as scholars to investigate it and to transmit, to communicate what we find out to people the engineers and computer scientists who are making the stuff. The second, Strathern, which is never to be forgotten. The point is to see a difference. The question is the kind of connection one might conceive between entities that are made and reproduced in different ways, have different origins in that sense, but which work together. Thank you very much.